It's the Let's Talk Polyamory podcast, where we talk about all things consensual non-monogamy, polyamory, open relationships, swinging, and how you can have secure and sexy relationships, no matter how you do them. Now here's your hosts, Tara and Andre.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Let's Talk Polyamory podcast with Tara and Andre.
Hey.
Hi, Andre.
Hello. Hi, Tara. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone. So at the time of recording this episode, it's the week of visibility for non-monogamy. And so in this episode, we're going to be talking about what does it mean to be visible and being out and open as polyamorous. And so we're going to share some of our stories, why visibility is important, etc. But before we jump in and talk about that, if anyone's listening to us for the first time, let's introduce ourselves.
Yeah, you want to go ahead? You go, please.
You go. I always go first, so maybe you should go first.
I'm going to introduce you as Tara Lynn Franco. You are a relationship and awesomeness coach, and you are quite the awesome coach at that.
And you are Andre Turcotte. You're a sex positive registered psychotherapist and coach. Together, we are the co-founders of this podcast, as well as our Let's Talk Polyamory community and creators of Polynewbies digital course. And so our passion is to help people create healthy and secure non-monogamous relationships. Well, really all relationships, right? And navigate some of the bumpy things that come up. And today's topic might be one of those bumpy things that might come up for you as you decide if you would like to be more visible as someone who's non-monogamous. So we invite you to always check out the show notes, because we'll include the links to our group and to our services and anything we talk about in this podcast. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that we do help in all relationships, because I think that a lot of what we say is not just limited to non-monogamous, but just relationships in general, right? So learning how to speak of your own desires, your own position, being able to communicate effectively and openly and honestly, those are things that will serve you whether you are a solo poly or deep long-term monogamous, whatever it is. They're just good ways of relating, right? But it's interesting also to think about this week of visibility and how many people that I know are not wanting to be announced as not monogamous, that they themselves may not feel yet secure enough, or it is their preference to announce themselves this way for a whole bunch of reasons. And maybe we'll have a chance to look into some of those reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a choice, and neither one is right or wrong. It's the one that's right, similar to the style of relationship, is the one that's right for you. So we're going to talk a bit about that.
It is a choice, Tara, and there is no right or wrong. But the part that I take exception with is people feeling as though they will not be accepted, or they're going to be judged, or that they might even feel some consequence in announcing their position, whether that means that they are polyamorous or open relating or queer or whatever it might be. The idea that there might be judgment put upon them, or there might be exclusion.
Yeah, or other ramifications. And I think that's especially important now. Like, part of me really feels like this year, Pride and this week of visibility and any of the celebrations of our diversity as it relates to our identity are super important this year, because I feel like there's been movements to take away some of those rights that have been well gained. So we're going to talk a bit about that too. But let's talk about Week of Visibility. At the time of this recording, it's July 7th to the 13th, 2025. It's celebrated every year. A group called Open Love in New York created it. And the idea behind this was to celebrate diverse relationship structures beyond non-monogamy. So polyamory, open relationships, relationship anarchy, swinging, anything like that.
So many different shades, right? So many different ways of relating. It's so interesting too, how in the West, we have very often come to believe that monogamy is the standard measure, when in fact, if we look globally, we find out that the minority of people do relate in monogamous ways, that in fact, polyamory or open relating or different ways of relating is far more common than what we're led to believe here in the West, that monogamy is the way.
Yeah, and there's many great aspects to both monogamy and non-monogamy, and we'll talk a bit about that, which is why one of the other reasons behind having this week is to challenge some of the stigma and misconceptions that people have about this style of relationships. And in fact, we did a whole podcast episode about myths around polyamory, which is quite interesting. So we'll make sure we include the link to that one, or you can just search it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's also important to point out, it's important for me to point out that while we do speak about the positive aspects of non-monogamy, it's not that we are putting down monogamy. There are many wonderful aspects to monogamy. And I think that you and I, in our particular relationship, we often do present in a rather monogamous way. We have great emotional investments in each other, but we take some of those parts and then we blend it with the other aspects, the positive parts of polyamory, open relating that we like, and we create our own narrative in that way, as many people can do. There's no one perfect way of doing this.
Absolutely.
Whatever suits you.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the reasons for celebrating it this week is to promote inclusivity in the broader public context. So in healthcare, media, education, and law. So making room for relationships that don't follow the monogamous norm. And, we've definitely seen some changes in terms of other identities and recognition of those things. But I think non-monogamy is the one that's still the one there's not such openness to recognizing non-monogamous pairings or groupings as a legal structure. And so that can impact people in terms of like children and wills and all kinds of things.
Yeah, that recognition is important. And it's interesting how this week comes off the tail of Pride in many countries, many areas. But in the Pride flag, in the representation of Pride, we see it as perhaps our sexual identities and the way that we are, whether we are gay, queer, trans, whatever. But does it also leave space, and should it leave space for how we relate to each other, right? Kind of like on that GSERD measure, right? The idea of our gender, our sexual expression, our relating styles. Should that also have place for it? Because if we can't announce it here, where might we? When would we have an opportunity to say, well, there is an alternative to your understanding of relating, and I'm just as valid in the way that I do it as well. I would need to be and want to be recognized as I recognize yours. And as you mentioned, in law, we might be able to recognize civil marriage between a male and female presenting, and now gay marriage in some places even that's being tempered. But are we able to be recognized if we are not in that category as a mono?
Yeah, absolutely. And we did a podcast too about should polyamory be part of Pride? And there's lots of people who think that it shouldn't be our relational diversity, whereas we think that it's part of our identity. So part of the week is also about uplifting these voices and giving them space. And when we were preparing the notes, you wrote in it that it's double trouble if you are already in the minority. So you identify as queer or trans, bi, gay, lesbian, whatever, but also non-monogamous. So then you might have, additional barriers to being accepted and that sort of things. And so what I love about what they do about this week is that each day has a theme. And so the idea is to inspire reflection and even storytelling and action. And so groups and organizations like us around the world are doing talks and events and posting on social media and being out there about visibility. And for us, we're doing this podcast, but we're also on our social media. We are going to be doing a daily post for each theme that includes some of the reflections and actions we're talking about today. So I think that's pretty cool.
It is very cool. And I love that in each day, there's a theme that invites our sharing, our personal reflection, because not only does it help to destigmatize and normalize this idea, these different ways of relating, but also hearing the personal stories makes it very relatable. We might see ourselves, hear ourselves in those stories as well. But by talking about it, it really does bring it out of the shadows, so to speak.
Yeah. And we're all about talking, Andre? Like we're all about talking.
For sure. Early on, I remember thinking that, here's this wild world of swinging, open relating. There will be many interactions with people and many, physical, sexual interactions perhaps, but really come to find out that that is a component of it. But so much more of it is really about communication, being able to communicate well And again, as we said earlier, it's not limited to just the physical romantic relationships, but it transcends to how we relate to each other in every aspect of life. It's all about communication.
Absolutely. And if I might share a quick little story, I was at a friend's birthday. Actually, I'm still at their place. And I ended up sitting on the couch and talking to a couple people. And someone introduced me to someone. And I don't know how it came up that I was a relationship coach. Anyways, the guy was like, "Oh, really? Can I ask a question?" And I was like, "Sure." So then we started talking about a situation he was in. And I thought it was really interesting that the other friend was, because he was asking a question, he was unsure about this interaction he's had with someone. And the other person was like, "Well, you need to ask them. You have to communicate. You have to talk about it, ask the question." And I just loved how he positioned it in like the nonviolent method of like,
Mm-hmm.
"I noticed that," or "when this happened." And I was like, "Oh my God, love." But he said, like, if you don't know something, you got to ask, and, we got to talk about it. And I think that's the muscle that I feel like I've grown the most in this whole 8-year journey that we've had into non-monogamy. So
I agree completely. I'm shaking my head in affirmative. Yes, absolutely. That muscle that we've grown over those 8 years, looking back, I was in many ways so naive to it. I did not know yet. And my level of understanding and appreciation for it has grown tremendously. But that's not to say that it's over. I think we're always with the opportunity of learning more about it and finding out, remaining curious, asking questions, and figuring it out.
awesome. So that was a big, long intro. But in this episode, we're going to explore more about what it's like to be visible. We're going to reflect on our own journeys about being out and polyamorous and why visibility matters. We're also going to talk about those themes, as we mentioned, and, invite you with some, questions and such to reflect on what being visible means to you. But I want to make an important note, and we made it at the beginning, I think it's important to make it again, that this concept of visibility is an invitation. And so this is not a prescription. And, for you to explore your own relationship with visibility, as someone who identifies as non-monogamous. So while visibility is super powerful, it's not always accessible or safe to people. So both being private and visible are valid choices. So I just wanted to say that again, make that point.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That is wonderful and well phrased, that it is an invitation. I am in a position of privilege in the sense that I am without much consequence. I am able to speak openly because my family might know it, and I am self-employed in many ways. So I don't really have potential for consequence, but I can appreciate that other people might not feel so secure in doing that. But then the question is, are these concerns, these possible fears, are they well-founded, or are they in my head? What would happen if I were to announce myself in that way? Would I be subject to consequences? Would my family disown me? Would my employers give me a hard time? What would it be like? Or do I imagine that it would be difficult? Because for me, it was difficult in the beginning to announce it, but then I found out, well, it is acceptable. And if it's not acceptable to them, it's acceptable to me at least. But the consequences were not as horrible as I had imagined. But also the other point is that if I stand forward and you stand forward and they stand forward and collectively we become a real thing, well, then we are valid in that way. It makes me think back to, back in the 50s, what it was like to announce yourself as being gay. It would have been very, very difficult. You would have been ousted rather. And even in the DSM, homosexuality was considered a mental illness at one point.
Yeah,
imagine
exactly.
That. And yet we come together, and now it is acceptable. We've normalized that. And the same goes with being non-monogamous, how we can come to be valid as well.
Okay. So when we say visibility, we are talking about, like you said, being out about your relationships with others, but also about being honest with yourself. Because sometimes we need to face, what we really are. And that can be hard, especially if you've grown up in a particular culture where monogamy is the way to be and anything outside of that is wrong. And some people are open just to friends. Some people are open to family. Some people are open to coworkers online or just in private relationships. And I think it's important to say as well that visibility can feel liberating and it can feel freeing, but it also can be something that feels exhausting or exposing because as soon as you come out, then people might start asking questions. And of course, you can set a boundary and not answer those questions, but people are often very curious about it. I mean, I'm always happy to talk about it and why it's important to me and why it makes is a fit for me in terms of my relational identity. But it can be, if people give you a hard time about it, can be quite exhausting. So,
Tara, that's so interesting because it reminds me of what it was like before I came out and how I was on this relationship escalator. I just imagined that I would have to kind of always be in a relationship. And then I found out later on that I was, in fact, a serial monogamous, that I would go from one relationship to another, not believing that I was able to announce myself as wanting something else. In fact, I thought of myself as rather corrupt in what's wrong with me? Why can't I, or why don't I want to simply be with just one person? And it made me feel very bad about myself in that way. I didn't know that I could come to it and say, well, my preference is to have many different people in my life, and that would in itself eventually become acceptable. But there was a lot of shaming. And then even not long ago, even perhaps even currently, people might come across a website, a dating site, for example, and see somebody who's polyamorous and think, well, when is this person going to just grow up and settle down? There's still a lot of judgment towards it.
Yeah. And that's some of the myths and stuff we talked about in that podcast about that. And I think for me, like prior to us coming to this decision that we might explore non-monogamy, I always felt when I was in relationships that, you would do that whole relationship escalator thing, right? You date, you get to like each other. And then you get to that point where you're like, okay, are we going to only date each other? And then if you were dating multiple people, like if you were out doing the normal dating thing as a single person, you might have to come to a decision where, well, who do I choose? And I remember several situations in my life, particularly when I was older, having a really hard time with that choice. And so I remember just before you, in fact, two very different people that I was dating. And I really liked them for very different reasons. They were totally different people, but super awesome in their own way. And I did love both of them. And I had to I felt I had to make a decision. And so I remember being agonized by that. And, I made a choice, and I made the choice that seemed the most logical. And then I had to let the other person go, which was terrible. And so I didn't know anything different, that different existed. I also really always loved, maybe you know this about me, but I love flirting and I love meeting people and talking to people. And I think being non-monogamous, even if I don't pursue something, it gives me sort of the freedom to be able to do that and enjoy that and not feel like it's something that's wrong,
It's interesting to hear you speak about those two people who might have been rather different, but how together they would make a wonderful partners for you, right? So why should we have to kind of dismiss all the wonderful qualities of one, and that society impose idea that we have to choose, as opposed to saying, well, I have good times, good energy with you, but I also enjoy my interactions with the other person. What makes it so important that we limit it and say, well, I could only be loving one person, I could only be loyal, I could only be receptive to one person's love, and we just don't think that that's quite right.
Yeah, it's not right for everybody. And we've said that before. For some people, it is perfectly awesome. Like they meet somebody and they're super happy to be just with them. And that's like totally cool. We're not yucking that yum, but everybody has a different way of relating. And, this just fits. The friends that I'm staying with here, we always end up talking about this because, when we meet in a group of people always find out in some way that we have a podcast, and they ask what it's about. And I say polyamory and they're like, oh, and they're very interesting. And then my friend always says that, this is such a great fit for me. And, like she says, it totally makes sense. And it doesn't make sense for her and her husband, but she's, it fits for us. So I think that's, the other thing is, figuring out what's right for you. And one is not more right than the other. I know we've said that a few times, but I like to stress that. So, because I know sometimes we get in our soapbox as to why it works, but, and so that's why we have this week, right? While consensual non-monogamy is pretty visible now, it's increasingly visible. It still is stigmatized. And so people that are in non-monogamous relationships as we said, can face discrimination in the workplaces or healthcare, child custody and legal systems, and also cultural and religious communities.
Absolutely. I think if we at times are tempted to get on the soapbox or feel as though we have to defend it, it is because, unfortunately, there is still a lot of misconceptions about, a lot of stigma attached to it, right? So as you say, we don't yuck the other person's yum, but we also want to advocate for ours. And we want to talk about these misconceptions. Like, for example, if I am a woman who is interested in open relating, there's almost an automatic assumption that I am going to be very interactive sexually with other people, right? But I'm going to be promiscuous. Or if I'm a dude who's interested in this, then I might only be in it for the sex as opposed to all of the rich emotional interactions I might derive from it. So we want to kind of counter those things. So at times it feels as though there's a need to announce this, and it might look like getting up on that soapbox. So forgive us if that is how it appears.
Yeah. But in fairness, there are people that are in it for that thing. And some people do use the label of consensual non-monogamy to be not consensual non-monogamous, or to just have sex, or to, whatever it is, and don't necessarily announce it. So that can be a situation, but that's also the situation in monogamy, right? People cheat, people are unethical, and that sort of thing. So you have the same bad players everywhere.
Right. Which is why E&M comes into play, right? The ethical or the consensual part of it. So there's nothing wrong with wanting to just have physical relations, multiple or even just one. But we ask that we try to do it in a place that is open and honest, that we announce that. And that way the other person can consent to it as well and say, yeah, I'm down for that. Or no, that's just not my jam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've been on this journey, official journey, I'd say, for about almost 8 years, because prior to meeting you, I was in a non-monogamous relationship. I wasn't necessarily consenting to that relationship, but I was nonetheless. But it's been a bit of a journey together, and we've done most of this together, which has been amazing. Lots of learning, unlearning, making mistakes. And, that's how we found our way to helping others explore non-monogamy, because we want people to have a great experience and build a strong foundation for their relationships. Because it's not easy. It's awesome, but it's also has its own landmines all over the place. So.
Yeah, that's amazing, right? Our 8-year journey. And as you say, all the learning and unlearning, all the misconceptions that I might have had going into it. But it's interesting also to think of how this has been a statement of non-monogamy, whereas before that, it often felt as though it was relationship avoidant. How can I delay or avoid just getting on the relationship escalator, but without having any idea of the vocabulary involved or the concepts or the validity of it, the possibility that this might also be a valid way of existing, a valid way of being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when we first decided to explore monogamy as a relational identity, we weren't necessarily out and open. We were doing things. We started meeting people, going to events, going to clubs, and that sort of thing. And so it wasn't until, for me, I think it was 2021 when I made a decision that I wanted to come out to family. And, at the time, it was important to me because during the pandemic in 2020, we had started our first online group, and we were becoming more out there in the community and on social media and that sort of thing. And I felt like I was really hiding, and I wasn't posting things on my personal side. I was being careful about what went on Instagram, and it just felt like it didn't feel authentic to me. And so it was super important for me to share with my family. I didn't actually expect that they were going to have as strong as a reaction that they had, but they did. So we have some videos, and so I'll put these as well in the show notes of our first conversation. You might remember, Andre, we had that conversation on the couch just before I called them to talk about what I was going to say, how I was going to position it, etc. I think we should actually do a whole podcast on that topic and go through some of those things that we talked about, because that was very helpful. Even if it didn't go the way I had hoped, it still was helpful to be prepared for that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. But I would love to know how it's changed since you did have that initial conversation in 2021, and how they've changed, how you've changed, what things have remained the same, what hasn't? Where do you hope to go for in the next 5 years on that? Can you share briefly about what it's been
Yeah.
like since?
Well, it was a very hard thing. And in fact, my parents didn't talk to me for a long time. They were very disappointed. You may recall they called us immoral and disgusting.
Disgusting. Yeah.
Yes. My sister was not wanting me to see the kids or have them come to Toronto and hang out with me. I guess they felt that she felt I was going to expose them to our friends, which is so interesting. But anyway, and it was very difficult. And they also, in some ways, rejected and blamed you for this, which was really hard because I, no matter what I said, no matter what I said, they wouldn't believe me.
Right. But I think, looking at it now in hindsight, I think maybe it is understandable that they would want to blame me because maybe it protects their image or idea of who you are, who they think you might have been, who they think they knew you as. But it's interesting too, because before coming out and making that statement, they knew you to be this reliable sister, this dedicated daughter, this wonderful person who has all these wonderful traits. And now you make this announcement, and suddenly all of those things are kind of cast to the side. They're forfeited, and now you are just immoral and disgusting.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem quite right either, right? Does it really impact or align with who you are? Does it really mean that if you are non-monogamous, then you are this kind of weird, perverted person without morals? And yet I know you to be a person with very strong morals and have wonderful qualities about you. So does your way of relating really dictate how you are or how you're not? Because there are horse thieves in monogamy and there are horse thieves in non-monogamy, just as there are good people in monogamy and good people in non-monogamy. So does the label, does the way of relating really dictate or inscribe who we are?
Yeah, that was the hardest part. It was like they completely forgot, like you said, who I was as a person. And I became 100% identified by this one thing. And they were very angry. We didn't talk. I was very hurt by their reaction. And it took a long time. Now I feel like in the last year, things have gone back to normal, even probably longer than that. But it took a while for them. It's like they had to relearn who I was as a person again, that none of this changes who I am. And in fact, it surrounds me by a lot of people that love me. And I don't know if they knew necessarily, but when I had my 50th birthday, which was 3 years ago now, they came out to Toronto. And it was a mix of people that were both like friends that share the relational identity as non-monogamous, and then people who are, regular, vanilla, whatever. It was a mixed party and they loved everybody. And my dad even said, he made this like grand speech about, thanking everyone for coming and for showing their love for me. And so maybe they figured it out and were like, oh, okay, I get it now. Or maybe they just didn't know. I don't know.
I'm glad to hear that they seem to have come around to it at least a bit. The needle has moved, because just before hearing that, I was wondering if this is the consequence of coming out. It almost sounds like a warning. Are we wanting to come out to friends and family then, to our employers, if it is going to be received in a way that is perhaps unfavorable? But are you now glad that you came out to them? Has it become satisfactory enough? And what, if anything, would you have done differently?
Oh, that's a good question. A whole podcast episode could be talked about that. But I think I am, number one, I'm very glad I did it. It was super important at the time. It's still super important to me. I think as people who advocate for non-monogamy and who support people who are non-monogamous, I think it's important that we're out and public about it. And that was a value that both of us had. I wouldn't change that at all. I'm glad I did it. Would I do it differently? I don't know. Do you think I should do it? Could have done it differently? I mean, we did it on the phone, on video call. I don't know why I felt it was necessary at that moment. I think we had the conversation and I'm like, I just got to do it. I got to rip the Band-Aid off. I was just tired of being hidden. So in that way, I felt like I was available to be out there. And I think now a lot of people know because I post stuff across my socials and that sort of thing. And friends of my parents know, and nobody says anything.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
But it's interesting for people who might be in that position where they are identifying with the relating style that we're speaking of, and then yet maybe not come out, and how they can kind of draw on your experience of what it's like to come out, and some of the things that we might say and some of the things that we might not want to say, and how we can frame it. Maybe we might have the luxury of deciding when it's going to happen, as opposed to being outed or them finding out and then not being able to have a chance to invite that kind of conversation. But also realizing that the recipients may not yet be open to this idea. So we should really manage our expectations, have some idea of what we can realistically expect, what are the worst case and best case scenarios, to talk about it with ourselves, to talk about it with trusted loved ones before, and then being able to position ourselves so that the conversation has the best chance of going well.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point, is you have to figure out why it's important to you to come out and to share this. What are you trying to get out of it? And also release yourself of the results, because, it may or may not be as you like. I mean, another part of it you mentioned, which I forgot, is that I didn't want someone else to out me. And I was getting worried that would happen. And I wanted to share the story the way I wanted to share it. And if you recall our conversation, we talked about what makes non-monogamy important for me, and what do I love about it, and what does it mean to me, and sort of like pre-busting some of the myths they might have. I mean, they still went with the myths, but whatever. I think that I think their reaction was they were concerned more about my safety. Like that was really the underlying thing. And I think that's fair. I mean, they're my parents. They don't want me to be hurt. And, anything that seems like it could hurt me, of course, they're going to be like, have strong feelings about it.
Right. But that's not to say that being in a monogamous relationship, you're going to automatically be safe. I mean, who are we getting into bed with, quite literally? But for me, also, the idea about coming out speaks to the level of honesty, the idea of being able to announce ourselves, right? To my own self be true. Whereas if we are to be advocates for this lifestyle and want it to be normalized and accepted, for me to have a pen name and do it all kind of anonymously, for me, implies that there's still some form of it being unacceptable, as opposed to saying, well, this is just who I am and I'm going to announce it. And it's because it makes me feel that I'm being more honest with myself and more honest with the people that I might come across or might interact with.
Absolutely. And then you had a different experience than me to coming out to your mom. I mean, we sort of came out almost together. I mean, did you actually officially tell her at any point, or did she just know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how it came to be, but I do remember one particular conversation at the end of it where she said, well, I think it's a wonderful idea. And if I were still dating, it's how I would want to be. I like the idea of knowing many people. I like the idea of, and as my other friend says, of not putting all my eggs in one basket, of having a diverse portfolio, and that it seemed like a quite interesting way.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Your mom was always supportive of us. And, she even helped us like do makeup and make costumes for parties and stuff like that. She was so open to the idea. And she was amazing to me, like during that time with my parents, because that was a very difficult time. And she took me under her wing, and I'm forever grateful for her because of that. She really loved me up when I had that huge gap in my life where I was hurt by my own family.
Yeah, absolutely. No, she was very understanding in that way. But she also said something to me that I think applies here. And that was that her rights ended where yours began, and your rights ended where hers began. In other words, it kind of like, don't yuck my yum. So just because I'm wanting something doesn't mean that you have to subscribe to it. But I would like you to recognize where my boundaries are, that my way of being could be just as valid as your way of being, even if they're not wanting the same things, right? That tolerance for each other, that recognition of each other.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
The visibility.
All right. Well, let's talk a bit about the themes of Week of Visibility for Non-Monogamy, because I think it's a great way to talk about a lot of the topics, and we've covered a lot of them already, but let's go through them relatively quickly, and we can share some reflections and some actions. So
Let's do it.
Today, at the time of recording this, is Monday, and today's theme is history and culture. And so the idea under today is to kind of talk about and reflect upon how consensual non-monogamy has always existed in various forms across time and culture.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because anthropologists indicate that there have been many, many societies where monogamy was not the default setting, that it was a village that raised children, that we were communal in many ways. And it's interesting how history may be rewritten in a sense, having us believe that monogamy is the way and it is the word of God. That is a great interpretation, but it's not necessarily historically accurate or the only way of being. So it's good to kind of look at our history and our culture in that.
Yeah. And also look at your own personal history. Like if you look back in your life, just like we have, thinking about how you've been in relationships and things that have come up and your own cultures. It's interesting to explore, how that might influence how you've been and also how you feel or what your comfort is in terms of being more visible as non-monogamous, if you're exploring that or you've already become non-monogamous. So.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of how in many different ways, whether it is our sexuality or our sexual identity or how we relate to others, how if we are not part of the norm, how we might feel as though we are outside of that. And then how does it make me feel about myself? So in the example of monogamous, if I was not really subscribing to that type of orientation, it often left me feel as though there was something wrong with me for wanting to be a different way. That they must have all been right and I had it wrong. Being queer, being gay, society is that way and I am the outcast, I am wrong, as opposed to saying, well, there are many, many different flavors to this pot and they're all equally valid.
Yeah. So I think today is a good day to kind of reflect on how when you might have discovered others who felt like you did, your people, how that might have felt validating. So if you're having trouble or if you're experiencing things in the opposite direction, remembering that there are people that are exploring the same things as you, that identify the same way as you, and, reminding yourself that it's a good thing.
To that point also, Tara, I want to say how we don't have to make a declaration, sign it, and then it will be left in the archives forever. So in other words, maybe at one point in my life, monogamy did feel like the right thing, and maybe polyamory or being open felt like the right thing, and maybe it changes again where I go back to feeling monogamous. It is not written in stone. We are plastic. We are free to change our mind. Whatever feels comfortable and right for us, I think is important to remember, that there needn't be one way of being forever and always.
Yeah, absolutely. And so some things that you can do today is explore books or podcasts or documentaries about relationship diversity across different cultures and histories. So maybe do some research online and listen to some things. There's a great book called Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan and I can't pronounce the first name, Jethra. This book challenges the conventional understanding of human sexuality and that monogamy is not our natural state and that our evolutionary past was quite different. And so that might be an interesting read to help feel more valid if you're not feeling validated in your identity right now. You can also share a story or fact that you've learned about this on your social media or with friends if you feel comfortable doing that.
Awesome.
So tomorrow, Tuesday, the theme is identity and inclusion. A reminder that visibility isn't equally accessible to everyone. And so not just people that are non-monogamous, but for people of color, queer, disabled, and others with marginalized identities.
True.
And so, sorry, were you going to say something?
No, go on, please.
And so thinking about inclusion, not just for non-monogamy, but for all diversities, is allowing for complexity. So people practice non-monogamy for many different reasons, and they may be a combination of things, non-monogamous and queer, non-monogamous and gay, etc. And also within non-monogamy as an umbrella term, there's also different styles of relating, and they're all different, which is why we always tell people if they are meeting people and someone says, oh, I'm polyamorous, or I'm a swinger, or I'm in an open relationship, is to figure out what exactly that means to them. And so we recorded an episode, which I think is a really good one, which is called How We Love. And we talk about the different styles of non-monogamy and helps you figure out what that is. And we even have a worksheet that's associated with that. So that's a good listen as well.
Yeah, it makes me think back to that image that has all of the different styles of relating and all the lines going through them. And it looks like it kind of looks like a wiring plan to a very complex mechanism. But it's quite interesting when you start looking at it and you see that there are so many different ways of relating. And it's not just your grandparents' way of one-on-one norm that you have to fall into, but you might find yourself in there, and you might find yourself in there in a number of different positions, different ways of being, and it might change over time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we don't identify as one single thing under non-monogamy. We sort of have a variety of things that we explore or enjoy at different times. I would say I'm polyamorous, but I would also say that sometimes we're more in an open relationship, or we're maybe more lifestyle swingers sometimes if we're going to clubs or events or parties. We don't also have to be one thing. And so we're complex beings.
Yeah, I think that, as you say, and adding to that, maybe we're kind of monogamish, but it's the idea of being philosophically open to relating in ways that might work well for us, or having less of what we're not wanting and more of what we are wanting.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with you. We're probably more monogamish now, and that has to do a lot of times with, time and space, right? I don't have time right now. I'm doing a lot of things to explore other relationships, but I'm also really enjoying the time that I spend with you. And so because we live in different cities, when we see each other, it's like we might not have seen each other for a while. And so we're really enjoying that connection. We still see friends and that sort of thing, but I'm enjoying what we're doing right now. Mm-hmm. But that could also change, right? Someone can have a date tomorrow, and that's totally cool too. So that's identity and inclusion. So the next theme that comes up on Wednesday is myths and misconceptions. So I think this is a great theme. And like I mentioned already, we did a debunking common myths, Let's Talk Polyamory podcast episode. I don't know why I'm having so hard time saying that. Yeah, because I think the common misconception out there is it's just about sex, or you're afraid of commitment, or you must not value stability, or you're playing the field, or, that
or
sort
when
of
are you
thing.
going to grow up and get a real relationship?
When are you going to grow up? And in fact, I think that's one of the things that my parents have come to learn. You and I have been together for almost 8 years. I'd say this is a pretty committed relationship, regardless of how it identifies. It's my longest relationship, at least. So, and it's yours other than the cat, right?
Yeah, other than Coco the cat, who I had for 19 and a half years. Yes, this is by far my longest relationship. But I think the way that it is possible to have a relationship of this longevity for me is the idea that I don't feel as though I'm in any way stifled by it. So that speaks to my attachment style in a sense, but also the honesty that we are able to talk about these things, our communication, our ability to talk about things which we've learned in our journey of open relating. And I think those elements have really made it viable for me, that it would be something I'd want to participate in.
Yeah. So some of the things that you can reflect on and do on Wednesday, if you'd like, is you can listen to the podcast if you haven't caught it. You can write down any myths that you've encountered. And, if someone said something to you, you can think about, like, what would you say that's different? It's kind of good to have a bit of an answer for people when they say, oh, does that mean you just want to have sex with everybody? Or, you're, it's not for married people, or whatever it is, you know what I mean? And, So think about any of those and you can, come up with answers if you like, if that feels aligned for you.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. So you might already start defining what it is and what it is not for you, and how you want it to be considered, how you might want people to know where you're at with this, if you are wanting, which kind of leads into Thursdays as well, about being public and private, right? And as you say, visibility is a sliding scale. It's not an all or nothing decision. How much do I want to come out? To whom do I want to come out? What do I want them to know about it? And what parts do I prefer to remain private? And it's all for you to say. It is for you to divulge, that you would feel confident in it.
Yeah. And, this is where sometimes people feel like they're always explaining yourself. And that can be a boundary. You don't have to explain yourself. And like you said, it's always your choice on how private or how public you want to be. We've made a pretty big decision to be public about everything. Like, I don't hide anything. I even post up on my LinkedIn. And so, there's people that I know professionally on there through previous work and that sort of thing. I don't necessarily talk to them about it, but it's out there for people to know if they want to know. So,
but it is always your choice. And we would never pass judgment over people who are not able or willing or wanting to announce themselves, right? And also, we hold place to that. It's never anyone else's job to out the other person or to announce it for them.
Yes.
There's no judgment. There's no right or wrong way. It is your own comfort level. If you feel secure enough to, then we invite you to the invitation. But if not, we will stand in alliance and still hold space for you.
Yeah, because sometimes it is about safety and self-preservation, and that's important. And so some things that you might want to reflect on is, what does visibility look like for you? And what does privacy protect? And what does visibility offer to you? And so if you feel comfortable in sharing your story, either like anonymously or with your name, the Week of Visibility group has an ability to share your story. And so we'll post that link to do that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, such a great idea. I love that.
And so Friday is sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, which brings us to Friday, about law and advocacy.
Yes. And so as we've already mentioned, most laws weren't made with polyamorous or multi-partner families in mind. So this can impact people in terms of custody, housing, healthcare, and taxes. Your favorite, taxes. So bringing about greater visibility for non-monogamy as a relational identity, a valid relational identity, is important in terms of law and advocacy.
Tara, you mentioned my predilection to taxes and wanting to be recognized in that way. But again, I'm not saying that it's going to be an easy thing to recognize, because there are so many different ways of relating. So what would constitute recognition in this way? But at least we can start with having a dialogue that does consider that there is an alternative to this het norm way, this het norm model.
Yeah. So if this is something that you're interested in, you can always research local or national organizations that are advocating for non-monogamous families. You can consider supporting them as well, if it feels aligned. And so the rest of the week is all about integration and reflection, how you want to be visible, how that aligns to your values and lifestyle, whether that means being out or doesn't mean being out. But I think it's important, even if we don't want to be visible in a public way, is thinking about living truthfully to ourselves and what that looks like and what that means. And they don't have to be the same. You can live truthfully and not be public about it. They can be two separate things. But coming to terms with it and being, how you might support yourself being more comfortable in being non-monogamous. So, yeah.
Well said.
Awesome. So we invite you, as we said, to think about what visibility means to you today. Where you feel safest being visible and where do you feel most vulnerable? Are there some small acts of visibility or intentional privacy that you could take this week or any week that you're listening to this? We'd love for you, of course, to engage in our posts and try out some of these reflections and actions if they feel good and aligned. You can share your story on Week of Visibility, and we'll give you the links as well to the How We Love and the Debunking Myths podcasts. And if you're still figuring things out in terms of how you want to relate in a non-monogamous way and do it in a way that feels secure and safe and awesome, we invite you to check out our Poly Newbies digital course, which is a self-directed 7-module course. So you can explore what's possible and build a strong foundation for that. And we'll share a link for our special Week of Visibility offer.
Indeed. Tara, as you said that this whole week of visibility is an invitation again to come out and join us to announce yourself. But also, I would really like to hear from the people who feel that it's not possible to be visible, who feel invisible, who feel marginalized, who feel as though their way would be threatened if they were to make these announcements. How can they come out and be? They might want to, but feel as though it's just not safe enough at this time. We want to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'd love you to leave comments in the podcast or in the group, or you can send us an email. And thank you everyone for listening and reflecting and showing up during Week of Visibility. As we said, visibility is a choice. You get to decide what feels safe and true and aligned. And however you show up, you're part of this movement and you are seen by us and by everyone. And so thank you for listening today. And We'll catch you on the next podcast. And thanks, Andre, for being an amazing co-host.
And thank you, Tara, for being an awesome co-host. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And we look forward to hearing from you in the next, and maybe you're hearing from us in the next.
Awesome. Thanks.
If you want to have secure, satisfying, and sexy relationships, check out our Poly Newbies digital course. It's 7 modules of all you need in one place. And as a thank you to our listeners, we're offering it at an exclusive price. Link is in the show notes, plus all the other awesome things we talked about today. Thanks for listening to the Let's Talk Polyamory podcast with TNA. Don't forget to subscribe and give us some love on your favorite podcasting platform. You can check out the show notes for any of the links to the courses or information we talked about today. Thanks, and have a fantastic and sexy day.